Hello, everyone. It's Ashley, and I want to welcome you back to the Secular Homeschool Revolution podcast. We're here for all you progressive BIPOC homeschoolers and allies who are ready to shake up some educational norms, be disruptors, change makers, all for your kids' education. So, today we are going to discuss women's history, whether the current administration wants to or not, whether Google wants to or not, we're going to do it. We're going to talk about why we have to celebrate women's history, why we need to put BIPOC women front and center, and how to make it a real part of our homeschooling in a way that is honest and not whitewashed. And before we jump in, I just want to share a little bit about what's going on in my life. We are trucking along. If you are new to homeschooling, please understand, and I think it's true too for people who've worked in education, October and February are some of the hardest months. I don't know, it feels like you hit a wall and burnout is coming and it's a drag for you and for your kids. At least that's what is like a common myth in homeschooling, and it was very true in my house. I was feeling some blues, but I couldn't figure out if it was because we didn't have sun here for like 4 or 5 days in a row, or all of the chaos being caused by our government, or being just overall February blues. But it was a heavy month for me. I'm shaking it off. I feel a little bit more productive just 3 days into March, but we didn't go as hard as we anticipated for the last 2 weeks of February, but we kept up, a good pace, and we're gonna just change our flow a little bit for March so we don't get too far behind. Spring break is next week. So I just wanted to let you guys know that for some reason, October and February are really, really hard months for a lot of homeschoolers. So if you felt that struggle, you weren't alone. All right, so let's get into our topic. I also wanted to make it crystal clear that when we're talking about women's history, we're also including trans women in the conversation, because history is not a debate about identity, it's about truth. And trans women have always existed, and their contributions to history, culture, and activism deserve to be recognized just like any other woman's. So I plan on doing an episode later this month in regarding trans women being included in Women's History Month. I want to talk about Rachel Levine, Sylvia Rivera, and of course, a nod to Marsha P. Johnson. But I wanted to make that clear that women's history does include trans women. Okay, but let me get into the topic. Every year, March rolls around and we get like this sense of empowerment. We're like, it's Women's History Month. It's so cool. It's so awesome. But we leave it at that, and we shouldn't. We should have the conversation of women's contributions year round. And I think that's one of the biggest benefits of homeschooling, is that we're not confined to this surface level history. We get to go beyond textbooks, and we get to really dive into the lives of women who have shaped our world. And too often, women's contributions are reduced to a single paragraph or a quick mention, or not very much at all. And we can do better. We owe it to ourselves to do better. We, again, have the freedom to also take an interest-led approach, letting our kids' curiosity guide us in the way that they would like to explore women's history in a more meaningful and personal way. So maybe your kid is fascinated by space. So you can spend time learning about Dr. Mae Jemison or Valentina Tereshkova. Maybe they love music, and you can take a deep dive into Celia Cruz or Sister Rosetta Tharpe or Missy Elliott, because Missy Elliott is that girl. But the point is, we can make these lessons engaging and connected to our kids' passions. And it's also important that we challenge the narratives that we were taught growing up. Because homeschooling isn't just about educating our kids, it's also about educating ourselves along the way. Because if you're like me, you're on this journey of decolonizing history, and your brain is probably, like exploding with all of the misinformation we were taught. And so we're having to unlearn it, and we're learning new information with our kids. Because, history isn't just about wars and presidents. It's about the movements, the organizers, the scientists, the artists, and the everyday people who push society forward. And women, especially BIPOC women, have been leading that charge since the beginning. Because yes, it is awesome to be a mom. It is cool to be a wife or a partner, but that is not all on who we are or who these women were throughout history. And we have to acknowledge it. So as homeschoolers, we need to commit to making women's history an ongoing part of our learning journey. So we have to say it here and say it now that we are going to make sure our kids understand that women's contributions are not an add-on to history, but they are the history. So let's talk a little bit more about why we need to center BIPOC women in that history. So when we talk about centering BIPOC women in history, we have to recognize not just their contributions, but also their voices, their poetry, their resistance, their truth. And one of the most powerful voices we can turn to is Audre Lorde. Her poem Now is a demand for urgency, for presence, for action. I'm going to share with you guys. It is a short poem, but it is such a powerful poem. And again, it is called Now. Woman power is Black power, is human power, is always feeling. My heart beats as my eyes open, as my hands move, and as my mouth speaks. Lorde reminds us that our existence, our resistance, our storytelling is not something to be buried in history books or just to be celebrated once a year. It is a reminder that we are alive, that her words are alive, and resistance is happening now. And that's why we should center women like her during Women's History Month, because BIPOC women haven't just contributed to history, they are history. They shape the present, and they will define the future. So when we teach our kids, we do have to be intentional and push beyond the usual figures and beyond just reading about the past. We need to engage with voices like Lorde's that give us a call to action, that will encourage our kids not to just learn about history, but to see themselves in it and to recognize power of their own voices and to understand that the time is now to honor and continue the work of women who came before us. So to truly understand women's history, we have to understand that it needs a complete overhaul. And we also need to center BIPOC voices, not just include them as an afterthought, because for a really long time, the focus had been on white women, which erases the experiences of Black, Indigenous, Latina, Asian, and other women of color. And this creates a distorted view of the past, and it makes it harder to understand the fight for equality. And when we look at the numbers, women of color made up 20.3% of the U.S. population, according to catalyst.org. And when we ignore 20.3% of the population's history, means we're ignoring a significant part of our society. BIPOC women also have to face challenges due to the intersection of race and gender. And that is offering a perspective that is missed. So if we're comparing it to white women, their struggle literally was because of their sex. They didn't have other layers of oppression like Black women faced. And when we highlight their stories, we're providing role models for all kids, showing that anyone can achieve greatness. And ultimately, when we center BIPOC women during Women's History Month, it corrects historical inaccuracies, it promotes social justice, and it gives us just a better overall comprehensive understanding of the world we live in. Give a shout out to these BIPOC women who shook up history. First up is Yuri Kochiyama. She was a Japanese American activist who worked alongside Malcolm X for civil rights and against U.S. imperialism. Next, Wilma Mankiller. She was the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation who revolutionized Indigenous governance. We also can give a shout out to Anna Julia Cooper. She was born into slavery and went on to earn a PhD from Sorbonne in Paris. She wrote a book in 1892 called A Voice from the South by a Black Woman of the South, and it was the foundational text in Black feminist thought, and she was a forever advocate for education and social justice. And again, we have never heard about her or any of the women that I mentioned. So again, let's do our due diligence to make sure their legacies live on. So when we're integrating women's history, more specifically BIPOC women's history, into our homeschooling journey, please understand it requires a very intentional, deliberate approach that you must be consistent with. So here's how I usually do it. I'm trying to figure out how to frame it the best way for you guys, but I know I talked about it a little bit last year. Whenever we're looking at historical narratives or historical texts, I like to ask, where were the women? What were the women doing? Especially like, where were the Black women? What was going on? Were there any change makers at that time? So, question when studying any historical period, actively question that traditional narrative. So, for example, instead of just learning about the American Revolution and our forefathers, ask, where were the women during this time? What roles did they play, especially BIPOC women? And then I have to do another search. Were there any women shaking up history at that time? And that's the information I include in our history. Because when we do have to get in this rhythm, if we're decolonizing history, to constantly question the traditional narrative. And we have to be mindful that the history that is currently given to us is often told from a Eurocentric perspective. So we have to actively seek out sources that center the experiences of BIPOC communities. Okay, so it is an extra leg of work. Some resources that you can look for. I recently taught my 8-year-old about primary resources. So she participated in the Black History Fair last month, and, she focused on Sojourner Truth. And so I was like, what were some texts that Sojourner Truth, released? And she came across the Ain't I a Woman speech. And so she found a copy of it online, and we listened to some other people read the Ain't I a Woman speech. But I told her this was anything that is a diary or a letter or a speech or artwork that is considered a primary resource, because that is often what they offer for their firsthand account of that said experience. Next, you can look for books and articles. And choose books and articles that are written by BIPOC authors and historians, that it's written from their authentic, culture, story, experience. That's very important. Next, documentaries and films. Explore documentaries that highlight the stories of BIPOC women. Again, if you have the Canopy app, I'm a ride or die for the Canopy app. You can access it if your library has a partnership with them. If they don't, send some emails, write some letters, talk to the head librarian to get it done. It's one of my favorite resources. They have lots of, especially right now for Women's History Month, documentaries that center Black women, Latino women, Asian women experiences at the moment. Next, you can also use online resources like websites and databases, because there are so many out there that are dedicated to BIPOC history and women's history overall. So, how do we center change makers? You do have to, again, do that extra leg of research to research BIPOC women who were change makers in their communities at that time. And you get to explore their contributions, really dive into their work, their struggles, and their triumphs. I mean, when you have these conversations of like what they accomplished, what they faced, even at like a young age, you can start introducing them again to that idea of intersectionality, because a Black woman's experience, for voters' rights is completely different than a white woman's experience for voters' rights, right? It was because she was a white woman, but then as a Black woman fighting for voting rights, majority of the white women like Susan B. Anthony didn't want to see Black women voting. So Black women had to worry about white men. They had to worry about Black men. They also had to worry about white women. So their fight for voting rights was a lot more difficult than the white women who were the face of voting rights, even though they were trying to suppress Black women's rights. It's pretty disgusting. Next is, another example. It could be the civil rights movement. A lot of times, the civil rights movement focuses on male leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. We all know him. So did y'all saw that Trump released the records that the FBI had on Martin Luther King Jr.? Again, if you listen to the J. Cole song, then you're not surprised. And I don't know, I just always heard about the things that, Trump was trying to release them, but I never put him on this pedestal, so it wasn't anything devastating. But again, back to my point, traditional narratives focus on male leaders like Martin Luther King. So how can we reframe this narrative? We can ask ourselves, well, where were the women? Who were the women? So during the civil rights movement, women, again, were the backbone of many local and national efforts. They organized boycotts, led voter registration drives, and also were activists. They were out there on the front lines. Some change makers during that time were Fannie Lou Hamer. She was, again, a voice for voting rights. She endured incredible violence, but she never wavered in her commitment to justice and her belief that Black people deserved to be able to vote. Another, change maker that gets dismissed in movements is Ella Baker. She was a behind the scenes organizer. She did mentor young activists, and she emphasized the importance of grassroots leadership. So there is, again, this documentary that came out called The Eyes on the Prize, and it is a really thorough documentary. We watched it last year, or maybe sometime last year, and it was a documentary over the civil rights movement. But what was really special about it is they gave a lot of talk time, at least like 15 to 20 minutes of the contributions of women in the movement at that time. So that was really cool. And then there's a documentary also called Freedom on My Mind, which I plan to watch with my girls. I've watched it and I'm going to plan to watch it with them. Um, and it includes, again, the inspiration behind the work that Fannie Lou Hamer did. So again, there are a few resources out there. I like documentaries, and I always tell my kids, let's pop some popcorn, get some pickles, and make it a night, and not a night, but like a cap on our day, and we get to have really cool discussions. And I'll like pause during the documentary and be like, ooh, what did you think about that? Ooh, do you think that's something you could have lived through? What do you think that's going to lead to next? So again, it can build those critical thinking skills. And most of all, I hope my girls remember watching just really cool documentaries with me when they get older. Okay, so whenever you're introducing like a woman of history, I think these are pretty consistent questions you can ask, like what challenges did this woman face during her time? How did she resist oppression and fight for equality? Because a lot of, women in history, especially BIPOC women, were, fighting for social justice causes, right? That means there was a power imbalance. Another thing is, what were their contributions to their communities and society as a whole? And how did their stories connect to current issues? Like, do we see a connection in the work that they did? Did that mean because they did it, their work was done? And again, that goes back around to if you're having those current event conversations with your kids and tying the history to the present, because I'm a very big believer that history does repeat itself. And like if your kids can see that pattern, that means they're getting to know history. I wish so many other people loved history in that way. But when you are incorporating these, I think, questions, I do think it can lead to a more inclusive and accurate, point of view of how diverse history is, especially with the contributions of BIPOC women. And I do want to give a quick shout out to my mother-in-law, Angela. She is no longer here with us, but she is here in spirit, and we appreciate her presence all the time. She was originally from San Antonio, and she was part of the first wave of students who desegregated schools here. And it wasn't easy. She did graduate at 16. She went on to an HBCU, Hampton University. And I think it's so funny because San Antonio was never, our ideal location. My husband just got an opportunity and we landed here. And my mother-in-law never gave him a lot of details about her childhood or her, family. It was just, very stoic in a lot of ways. And so since we've got here, we've overlapped her story more than we could have ever imagined. Like where my husband worked or where we both worked, it was around the block from within walking distance of the church his grandfather was a part of for many years. And he also was the first Black city councilman in San Antonio. So I think that's a pretty cool fact as well. And also, a lot of the older generation that we've met also knew her. And so when they see my kids, they're like, oh, I can see, the family lineage in their faces. And that's so funny. And the last thing I think is cool is that where we meet, for our community is directly across the street from the school that she desegregated from. And thinking about her being a change maker in education, and then us, still running from that education system because it was not built for us, is something to think about. But anyway, she was a part of the civil rights movement. She, I can't imagine, starting school at 14 and people treating you a certain way because of your skin color and having to be subjected to that every single day. But anyway, so shout out to Angela and all of her bravery. And again, it's a reminder of how much work we still have to go through, because in, our lifetime, people still remember, segregated bathrooms, water fountains, schools. So thank you for listening. As we wrap up, I do want to leave you with this thought. Teaching women's history isn't just about adding a few extra names and dates to memorize to your lessons. It is about shifting our perspective entirely. It's about recognizing that women, especially BIPOC women, have always been history makers. Even when the mainstream historians and educators refuse to acknowledge them, they're still there. So let's commit to making women's history a part of our everyday learning. Let's make sure our kids know the real story, the one that includes them, their ancestors, and the women shaping their future. I would love to hear how you're incorporating women's history into your homeschooling journey. Please share your thoughts with me on Instagram at secular_homeschool_revolution. Or if you're on TikTok, secular_homeschool_mama, MAMA. And if you found this episode helpful, please make sure to subscribe, share, and leave a review. It helps others find this space. Until next time, keep reimagining, keep revolutionizing your kids' education, and centering the voices that matter. Please, as always, protect your peace, and I will see you guys next week.